Hello and good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Zambia Discover Wildlife evening. This is the second of our presentations of the year, and it's lovely to see so many of you have joined us. Thank you all very much. It's great to see some familiar names, and it's also just as lovely to see some new names that we're not so familiar with as well. And thank you and welcome to you all. My name is Nick. I'm one of the directors of Wildlife Worldwide and the Travelling Naturalists, as is Chris, who is tonight's presenter, and he'll be talking shortly to all of you about his love for Zambia. I need to just go through a couple of technical issues and technical housekeeping points, please. We do hope to not have any technical problems this evening, but please do bear with us if something does not go quite according to plan. We would kindly ask, please, that if your camera is not turned off, then do please turn it off. And also the same with your microphone settings as well. If you wouldn't mind, please just muting yourselves. That would also be really helpful, particularly for the presenter. You can change those settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see that there's a little microphone icon, and that should have a red diagonal line through it, as should the video icon, to ensure that both your microphone and your video are not working. So we'd kindly ask for that, please. As the host, I do actually have control of those two elements for each of the participants. So if I need to mute one of you or turn your camera off, I am able to do that. Just to remind you, tonight's presentation, it is being recorded as well. I'm just going to let a few other people from the waiting room come into the presentation. And then what I'll be doing then is providing an introduction to Wildlife Worldwide, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the company as those who have travelled with us. And I'll also then provide an introduction to Chris, and Chris will then get started with the presentation. The presentation itself is about 35 or 40 minutes, and we'll have time at the very end for some questions. But if you just bear with me, I'm just going to mute myself again, and I'm going to let just half a dozen or so more people from the waiting room into the presentation. Hello again. I'm just going to let one more person here into the meeting room. If you just bear with me, admit. There we go. Great. Okay. So, for those of you who have just entered into the presentation, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Tonight's presentation is all about Zambia. And for those of you who are not familiar with Wildlife Worldwide, well, we started in 1992, so almost 30 years ago, and it began really focusing on African safaris, in particular Zambia, Tanzania, and Kenya as well, East Africa. There was also offerings in Asia in those early years, particularly India, and also the odd foray out into the Americas, particularly Canada, for the bears out there. Since then, the company has grown enormously and quite literally offer a truly global selection of destinations all over the world. We have Australasia, we have Asia, we have Africa, of course, being the core of what we do. but we also have a comprehensive range of trips available in Europe and also the Americas. And we wouldn't be a truly global company if we weren't also offering both the poles as well. Within all of that, we have a huge variety of wildlife and trip experiences as well. Photographic trips, group tours, tailor-made, expert-led tours. Nick Garbutt, being one of the great photographers in the UK, leads many trips with us. Mark Carwardine, the BBC naturalist, also. And I think it's fair to say that we would appeal to the general naturalist as well as the keen amateur and the keen enthusiast as well. So tonight's presentation is from Chris, and many of you will be familiar with Chris Breen. As I said earlier, Chris is one of the directors here at Wildlife Worldwide, but more than anything, he is the founder of Wildlife Worldwide. He first traveled to Zambia in 1983 at the tender age of, what, 65 or so, something like that, I think. No, I jest. He first traveled out there in 83. He made returns in subsequent years, and particularly life-forming for him were the 2 years he spent as a safari guide, working with Norman Carr of Norman Carr Safaris on his walking safaris and also all of the safaris that they offered in South Luangwa. Chris returned to the UK and became heavily involved with the travel industry as working as a sales consultant for a number of companies, and thought, well, actually, I need to do this for myself now. And as I said, in 1992, Wildlife Worldwide started, and it was really born out of Chris's passion and knowledge and expertise and his thirst to share the experiences that he had had in Zambia with anybody who wanted to travel with the company. So Chris, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I do hope that everyone enjoys the presentation. I should say to you all now that, as I said, the presentation is being recorded. We have already had quite a lot of questions come through for Chris to answer throughout his talk, but also at the end. So thank you in advance to all of you who have sent those through already. If you do have any questions that you'd like to raise during the presentation, you can email those to me, and I'll ensure that we answer as many of those at the end. So my email address is there in the bottom right. It's nick@wildlifeworldwide.com. So do please email those through during the presentation. Alternatively, we have a chat room, a chat facility, which is open throughout the presentation, and you can email those, you can message me with those questions as well then. So Chris, I'm going to hand over to you, and I will mute myself, and everybody, I hope that you're sitting comfortably. You have a glass of whatever drink you like close to hand, and do sit back, relax, and enjoy being taken on a journey to Zambia.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's an interesting platform, Zoom, and presenting in this way. I think I quite like it, though we could have bandwidth issues. Hopefully we won't have. And one of the things we do know is that the images don't appear quite so sharp on screen, on your screens, as they might do if we were presenting them on a big screen. So apologies for that, but I think that's largely an issue of technology. One of the things I really do like about Zoom and presenting from home is that I can sit here with my pint of vodka in my pajamas and my slippers below the waist, which of course you can't tell because I'm wearing a Wildlife Worldwide shirt. Anyway, look, enough of that. For me, is the ultimate safari destination. It has everything that pretty much every other African country can offer. And for that, it is really quite a spectacular place. What we're going to do is we're going to go on a bit of a journey around. I know that some of the writing on screen is not particularly sharp, so apologies for that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you first of all over here, if you can see my mouse, going to take you over to the Liwa Plains National Park. Then we're going to go into Kafue National Park. We're not going to go to Luangwa, which for the birders amongst you has Zambia's only endemic bird. And that endemic bird is Chaplin's barbet. We're not going to go there. We are going to take a visit to the Lower Zambezi. Then we're going to go up to Kasanka National Park and the Bangweolo swamps. And then we're going to go down into the Luangwa Valley, this amazing valley here, which is one of the ends of the African Rift. So we're going to start off by going across from Lusaka. We would generally fly across to Mongu. And from Mongu, we would drive up into Liwa Plains National Park. This is a very simple landscape shot at sunset of Liwa Plains National Park, which is an extraordinarily flat, wide, open wilderness. It's a place which you would really best visit in either the early months of the year, that is to say April, May, June, early months of the season, or the late months of the season, late months of the year from November onwards. That is when it's particularly good for the wildlife that's there. I say we fly into Mongu and we drive from there. We do sometimes fly in, but I personally love driving in Africa. I think it's a really wonderful experience. You meet wonderful people, you see and do some extraordinarily lovely things. And you really get a sense of how big the place is. You get a real sense of place. Once you get into the national park, there's a very good chance of seeing cats. Cheetah in Liwa Plains National Park are quite prevalent. We see quite a few cheetahs. This one's collared. Most of them are collared actually now. But the other thing about Liwa Plains National Park is that there is a big migration of wildebeest. The big migration of wildebeest is not big on an East African scale, where there is something like 1 million to 1.5 million animals. In Liwa Plains National Park, which is now deemed to be the second largest migration of wildebeest in Africa, there are about 50,000. But it's still a pretty amazing sight to see. And the best time to go there and see them is actually in November. As I said earlier, May and June are also nice times to be here, but you wouldn't see so much by way of wildebeest in May and June. However, you would see some beautiful wildflowers and lovely butterflies, very good bird watching to be had here at that time of year. There are a couple of camps here. There is camps, oblique lodges. There is really only one of note, which is set in a beautiful location, and of course offers all of the wildlife experiences you would imagine, driving safaris and night safaris and so on. This is not a place for walking safaris. Nick mentioned walking safaris earlier. This is I mean, you can walk in Liwa Plains, but Liwa Plains, because of the distances involved, Liwa Plains is very much a driving experience. Liwa Plains is a place where there are absolutely vast numbers of hyenas. The plains are flat and expansive, and there are huge numbers of hyenas. And everything here is, for some reason, all the huts appear to be gigantic, even the pups are big, but it is also a place of wild dogs. And you may recall a couple of years ago, well, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, there was an absolutely fantastic TV series, a BBC series, which I think was called Predators. That doesn't sound quite right. I've forgotten what it was called now. The advantage of having an audience in front of you is that invariably they know what the name of the thing is, and I can then be reminded of it. But anyway, there was a fabulous series, and the BBC filmed a pack of wild dogs out here on Lewa Plains. They were there shortly after I was there with a group. We had fantastic sightings of these wild dogs, and we watched them. We watched them from a standing start, if you like, where they were not even moving. They were completely relaxed. They were completely chilled out. They weren't bothered about anything. Suddenly, they decided they wanted to make a move. In this particular instance, with any luck, you can see my mouse. We thought they were going for this guy here, and in fact, they weren't. They were going for this one. And we watched them, 12 wild dogs. We watched them go from being completely relaxed to up, moving and killing within minutes, basically. They run fast. They were traveling at a considerable speed. I think we were doing about 35 miles an hour, and they were still accelerating away from us. Quite a sight to see. The hyenas invariably were going in and trying to steal what they could. The hyenas weren't especially keen on that, and the wild dogs weren't especially keen on that, and invariably they fought them off. The wild dogs were very relaxed. They're very relaxed around people. They were not bothered by people at all, and it was very easy once they killed, once they had then gone to have a drink, to be able to get very close to them. In actual fact, we were able to get out of the vehicles and get down. For those people interested in the photography side of things, we're able to get down on out of the vehicle, shelter next to the vehicle, and actually get very, very close to the dogs to take some nice shots of them. A wonderful experience. Lewa Plains, I would say, is probably not a first visit to Africa destination. It is quite a specialist destination. So I think you are likely to be interested in going to Lewa Plains if you've been to Africa on a number of previous occasions in the past. But it's a fantastic place nonetheless. Moving on from Lewa Plains, we are going to go to Kafue National Park. Kafue National Park was for many, many years the biggest national park in the world, at something like 9,500 square miles. It's not the biggest national park in the world anymore, but it's still, in my view, probably one of the finest national parks in the world. It has two very distinct parts to it. The northern section of the park, which is what we're looking at here, which is the Busanga Plains, and the southern section of the park, which is, so the Busanga Plains, I should say, are big, wide, open plains that are fantastic for all sorts of species and a number of predators, including cheetah, including lion. Not so much wild dog, but also huge herds of elephants and so on. These shots were actually taken from a hot air balloon. There's good opportunities to enjoy hot air ballooning whilst you're there. But Kafue National Park, as I say, is very much in two parts: the northern section, the Busanga Plains, and then the southern section, which is much more enclosed, much more intimate, which we'll have a look at in a second. Fabulous array of antelope in the park, including Liechtenstein's hartebeest, including sable and roan, and including large numbers of red lechwe, the same species of red lechwe that we see in Botswana in the Okavango Delta, despite the fact that there's hundreds and hundreds of miles between the two locations, which in itself is kind of interesting. It's also very, very good for lions. Particularly good for lions and to sea lions hunting. I will spare you the gory details of this particular incident, save to say that This is a young lechwe that was with its mother and a number of others. And the lionesses here are extraordinarily clever. And they actually wanted to kill one of the mothers, one of the big females. So what they did, and this is a known habit of this particular pride of lions, what they did was they walked slowly through the particular area that they were in, and split the adults from the youngsters. They then took this youngster, they picked it up, or this particular female picked up the youngster that started screaming, and the female lion here then knew that the mother would come and try and rescue its young, and so she took two rather than one. Extraordinary behavior. I've seen lots of lion kills, I've seen lots of amazing lion behavior, but I'd never seen anything like that before. And it was quite chilling in some respects, but also quite impressive, and a very unusual habit. The lions here, as I say, are amazing. They are very, very relaxed around vehicles, as they are in many places, of course, in Africa now. But it's an impressive place and an impressive sight. Moving then down to the southern part of Kafue, and if you're visiting Kafue National Park, it's well worth going to both the southern part of the park and the northern part of the park, because they really are quite different. In the southern part of the park, you are able to get out on the river, and the Kafue River is one of the big tributaries of the Zambezi. So it's a big, wide river, nice and clear. The river's nice and clear, and it's not especially fast flowing, and it's not full of big fallen trees. So it's not a problem. It's not a danger for boats to get out on the river. It's really quite easy. It's quite straightforward. One of the nice things about being on the river is having an opportunity to see things like this. I personally love photography, and of course I love the wildlife. Well, I love the wildlife. I love all the wildlife. I prefer the birding side of things, if I'm completely honest, especially when I'm in Africa. And it's amazing just floating past the kingfishers and herons, and sometimes eagles of various types. There's something about being in a boat and close to the water, which seems to make us invisible to, or rather perhaps not invisible, but less visible to some of the birds, and the kingfishers are great examples of that. And of course, therefore, it presents great photographic opportunities. One of the things that surprised me particularly about the southern part of Kafue, I've been there a number of times, but I was there just over a year ago now. It was towards the end of 2019, as a sort of a revisit from not having been there for a few years. One of the things that surprised me was the population of predators. And shortly before we got on our boat for an afternoon safari, and from which I took this picture, we had this beautiful leopard, which actually was sat, for those of you that have been to Brazil, I'm sure some of you have been to Brazil and been to the Pantanal and seen jaguars. This was an absolutely typical jaguar pose. If I'd been in the Pantanal, this is exactly where I would have looked, and I would have seen a jag. Of course, I wasn't. I was in Kafue National Park. This was about 15 or 20 being especially quiet. We weren't being especially noisy, but we weren't being especially quiet. But the leopards are also very relaxed there as well, and we see a lot of leopards from the boats on the river. And of course, because we're on the river, we don't pose a threat to them. And because we don't pose a threat to them from a photographic point of view, they are really quite straightforward. And of course, again, lions. This is a young male here, as you can see, and no guesses for working out what it is it killed fairly recently. In fact, I think this was actually killed by by a female, and needless to say, being a young male, it nicked it off the female. But I thought that was particularly interesting because that was a huge warthog looking at the size of its head. Accommodation-wise, Zambia has some magnificent places to stay, some really magnificent accommodations. And the style, although it is changing from what it was like some years ago, the style is still very local, in inverted commas. There's still a very distinctive Zambian style to the way that the camps and lodges are built. Lots of use of reeds, lots of thatching, lots of wood. The Zambian safari lodges are not particularly into gold taps and brass shower knobs and all this kind of stuff. It's a very authentic safari experience, any safari experience you'll have in Zambia. Invariably, the places that we stay, as you can imagine, and many of you will have stayed in many such places, but the places we stay generally are beautifully located. They will always be located in a perfect or near perfect place for wildlife viewing, and very often it's just very, very nice to sit in camp and watch the world go by. So in addition to your morning and your afternoon and evening drives, sometimes it's just lovely to sit in camp and watch the world go past, because there's always something. We're going to move on now to the Lower Zambezi. So the Lower Zambezi, stating the bleeding obvious, apologies if I am, the Lower Zambezi is that part of the Zambezi which is below Victoria Falls. Many of you will have been to Victoria Falls, I'm sure. Many of you will have been to Lower Zambezi. We'll come back to Victoria Falls right at the very end of this presentation. But the Lower Zambezi is another of Zambia's spectacular spots. This shot is taken from the middle of the Zambezi River, looking back to a beautiful camp called Chiawa. And it's looking back at a set of hills, which actually runs all the way from this part of the Zambezi all the way up, actually up into the Luangwa Valley. It's the escarpment basically, which runs all the way up to the Luangwa Valley, and provides, of course, a rather beautiful backdrop to the park. It's a bit like being on, it's curiously like being on safari in with an inland sea in front of you, because the Zambezi is so vast at this point. Generally speaking, you would fly into the Lower Zambezi. It's a relatively short flight from Lusaka. It's approximately 20 minutes or so from Lusaka Airport. We would tend to use Lusaka as a pivotal point. We might fly you out to Kafue National Park first, and then back to Lusaka with a quick connection on down to the Lower Zambezi. Invariably, when you get to the Lower Zambezi, you will be transferred to your camp or lodge by boat. Which is a lovely experience. You will get off a plane, probably a light aircraft, almost certainly a light aircraft. You'll be driven 5 or 10 minutes or so from the plane down to the jetty. You'll jump onto the boat, and then you'll be driven to camp. And then there's every chance that when you arrive in camp, you will be greeted by one of these rather majestic beasts. One of these rather wonderful and huge elephants, of which there are many. They might greet you also at lunch. because this is very much their home, and the Lower Zambezi is very much a place of ellies. And the Lower Zambezi is also a place where we try to make use of the river as much as we possibly can. We often combine a safari in the Lower Zambezi with a safari in the Luangwa Valley. And the Luangwa Valley is not a place where you can get out on the river, not in the way that we can here. So the combination of the two is particularly attractive. In addition to going out on these flat bottom boats, in actual fact, there's a lunch going on the boat behind this elephant. It's also possible to go out by canoe. The rather lovely experience of going out on two-man Canadian canoes. The paddling is easy. The wildlife is great. You're always paddling downstream, and it's always an afternoon activity because the light is particularly good. And again, elephants rule the roost here. It's another fabulous way of viewing wildlife. It's not only elephants, of course, but it's particularly nice getting up close and personal with these guys, actually from the water. Again, they're pretty relaxed. It's a completely different perspective on seeing wildlife and on photographing wildlife. Again, the camps and lodges in the Lower Zambezi are magnificent. This is a photograph of one of the rooms at Chiawa, which I mentioned previously, but there are other absolutely super camps and lodges down here as well. I said that in Zambia, generally speaking, the camps and lodges aren't so much into gold taps and so on. This Chiawa isn't either, although Chiawa is certainly one of the most luxurious of the properties in Zambia and one of the most luxurious of the properties that we work with. One of the key things about Chiawa, and I have to say about all of the places that we work with, is the quality of the guides and the guiding and the knowledge and experience that they have of their area and their wildlife, which includes not only the mammals, but the trees and the tracks and the trails and the birds, is absolutely exceptional. And that's one of the key reasons why we work with these guys, and they are really, really fantastic. We are now going to go on to Kasanka National Park. This is a real journey around the country. Kasanka National Park, just as a reminder from my slides right back at the beginning, but Kasanka National Park is here. It's number 6. It's a tiny, tiny park. It's only about 200 square kilometers. I was lucky enough to go there many, many years ago before anyone was selling Kasanka National Park here in the UK, certainly. But we've been selling it for many years. It's a fantastic place for birds and for birding, and it marks the pretty much on the watershed of the Southern African ecosystem, and this, which is the Central African ecosystem, and this, which is the East African ecosystem. So there's all sorts of interesting birds and mammals that appear here that you wouldn't necessarily see elsewhere. For birders amongst you, you'll see things like blackback barbet, you would see Anchiatus barbet, you would see all sorts of other interesting specials. For those of you that are interested in mammals, you'll see things like yellowback duiker and blue monkey. And the other key thing here is that it's absolutely excellent for bats. In fact, it is so excellent for bats that it is it's the destination once a year for about a month, 4 to 5 weeks, of all of the straw-coloured fruit bats that live in Africa. So nobody knows quite how many there are, and it's a comparatively recent discovery. but there are thought to be between 10 and 12 million straw-coloured fruit bats that come into Kasanka National Park. And not just Kasanka National Park, it's a small area of forest called Mshitu Forest, which is a swamp forest of about 2 kilometres square. And all of these straw-coloured fruit bats come into this area. We make use of a lot of hides here. I'll tell you a bit more about the bats in a second. We make use of a couple of hides. They're generally very high, but they are excellent for looking out over the swamp forest, which you can see in the distance, in actual fact, out here. This is some of the swamp forest. But it's also excellent for looking out across the papyrus, which is immediately in front of me, which in itself is amazing for Sitatunga, which is another of the water-dwelling antelope. For those of you that have been to Botswana, Sitatunga is really one of the prize spots, one of the prized sightings in the Okavango Delta, and a wonderful sighting it is too, and you can sometimes see quite a few. My world record here in Kasanka was 36 Sitatunga in view all at once. It is also, as I mentioned, a fabulous birdwatching location, and the chances are that if you were to visit Kasanka National Park, you would be the only ones there. Also wonderful opportunities to get out on the river. And as I mentioned, these guys, the straw-coloured fruit bats. You have to go there in late October, right the way through to late November. And that's when you'll see them. And you'll see them in their millions upon millions upon millions. It's one of the most incredible wildlife sites on Earth. It really is. It's a most extraordinary sight. And you can sit in a chair just to the edge of the Mshitu forest. You could even be as decadent as having a gin and tonic in your hand, in one hand, and your camera in the other, and you could watch these great plumes of tens of thousands of straw-coloured fruit bats coming out of the Mshitu forest. They come out in a great big line, vertically out, and then they all head off in the same direction. And they're all going off in the same direction. They travel about 60 kilometers at night time in order to go and feed on some fruit trees that are way, way off in the distance. Unless you happened to be on their flyway, you would never know that they were there. In the morning, you can get back and perhaps not with a gin and tonic at 5 o'clock in the morning, but I guess hardened amongst you might wish to do so. But maybe with a cup of tea and a bowl of cereal, you could sit in the same chair and you could watch them all coming back. And it's the most fantastic thing. It's one of the most wonderful, wonderful sights. It's the biggest mammal migration on Earth. And I highly recommend going there to see it. There's a couple of super places to stay when you're there. And this is one of them. It's on Wassa Lagoon. And it's a beautiful little camp. It's very, very simple. It's very straightforward. There's nothing luxurious about it, but with one or two super guides, if you're interested in doing something totally, totally different, I highly recommend it. It combines very, very nicely with the Bangrolu swamps. Livingston died about, well, a few hours away from the Bangrolu swamps, and I like to go to if I'm driving up, I like to go to the Livingston Memorial, which is not all that far away from where I took this photograph. It's a beautiful drive. It's actually about a 9-hour drive, but it's only about 15 minutes in a light aircraft. So you can sort of take your pick. One is a bit more expensive than another financially. The other is a bit more expensive in terms of time, but there's something lovely about traveling on the road in Africa, I think. When I first went to the Bangrolu swamps, I said to the pal of mine that I went with, this was many, many years ago, I said, Bob, will we see black lechwe? Because that's really, really, really what I wanted to see. I wasn't quite so enthusiastic about birds at the time. Will we see black lechwe? And Bob said to me, yes, we'll definitely see black lechwe. Anyway, we broke down and we got there very, very late and got into the place that we were staying at night time. Excuse me. And we woke up in the morning and I was desperate to see black lechwe, and there were black lechwe all around us. It was one of the most amazing sights. It's still the most incredible wildlife sight I think I've ever had. There were tens of thousands of them in all directions. And these are black lechery. They are endemic to the Bangweolo swamps. You can't find them anywhere else. They, of course, are related to the red lechery that we have in Botswana and also over in Kafue National Park, which we looked at earlier. But they're endemic to Bangweolo, and you don't find them anywhere else. And because Bangweolo is not a national park, which in itself is slightly curious, but anyway, it's not a national park, you can walk amongst them. They have quite an interesting flight distance, so they're always shuffling away from you. They're covered in lechery flies, so you have to be quite persistent, but it's good fun nonetheless. There's a number of other wonderful things you can see there, including Sesame, of course. There is an outstanding bird life here, being a wetland area. These are whistling ducks, white-faced whistling duck. And of course, the thing that many people go to the Bangweolo swamps to see, which is shoebill. This is the best place in Africa to see shoebill, without a doubt. The last time I was there, I saw 4 shoebills before breakfast every single day, and I was there for 4 or 5 days. And we went out to see shoebills as well. The other interesting thing about the Bangweolo swamps is that whilst there used to be cheetah there, they were hunted out many years ago, but they've just been reintroduced, and that's actually really rather an interesting program. So look, we're going to move on, and time is pressing. We are going to go on down into the Luangwa Valley. The Luangwa Valley is where I cut my teeth. It's really the first, well, undoubtedly the first wildlife place I'd ever been to. I didn't really know what a national park was, all rather ignorant, but there we are. Hey ho, I do now. This photograph, this image is of one of our walking safari areas, but this is one of the walking safari areas in the wet season, in this rather beautiful mahogany woodland. Just a bit of a reminder as to where the Luangwa Valley is. We were in Kasanka earlier. We were just looking at shoebills here in the Bangweolo swamps, and now we're here in the Luangwa Valley. So generally what we would do is we'd fly into Mfui, and then we would be collected in Mfui, and we would travel to one of our lodges with one of our guides. This is what it looks like from the air. This is actually taken from a microlight in March, so it's relatively wet. The wet season here throughout Central Southern Africa runs from November through to May, but from mid to late February, things are starting to dry up. However, it is very much a year-round destination if you choose the right place. This is what it looks like. Aerial shot of the Luangwa Valley in the wet, in the green season, as the marketeers call it. You can see it's a big, old, slow-flowing, silt-laden river, and there's lots of oxbow lagoons. The soil between the oxbow lagoons and the main river is incredibly rich. It provides a lovely source of grass and nutrients for small antelopes. And because there's a very good population of small antelopes, it's particularly good for predators. So in the wet, it looks like that. In the dry, it looks more like this. And this is a shot from August, so it still hasn't fully dried out. But you can see in the background on the left of that image, you can see an oxbow lagoon, or at least a dry oxbow, and you can see that it's much drier than it was in the previous shot. So there's far less water around, but there's always water in the main river, and that's where all of the main lodges are set, is along the main river. If you were to go there in the green season from March through to June, you will have amazing bird life. You'll have amazing bird life throughout, but it's particularly colourful March through to June, March through to May, June, because that's when everything is in its breeding colours. That's there's a huge number of migrant birds there. Greenback heron. These are knob-billed duck. The bright red bird was called a red bishop. And in the green season, when there's a lot of water around, it's nice. You can get out on boats sometimes. Sometimes you can get out on canoes. One of the big problems, though, is the enormous population of hippos in the Luangwa, which makes it particularly dangerous if you're in a boat. Puku is one of the Luangwa specialities. You see them elsewhere, but you see many of them in the Luangwa. Many of the national parks in southern Africa don't have puku. Though you do see them on the Chobe River. It's great, of course, for vervet monkeys and for baboons as well. This is a baboon, and it's really nice in the green season if you can be on the river to be at eye level with some of the birds. This is obviously fish eagle and ground hornbill. One of the things that always amuses me about some of the bird books that we use when we're out on safari is that they don't necessarily take any notice of the name of the birds. So one of the best bird books in southern Africa shows a photograph of a ground hornbill sitting in a tree, which of course they do, but always seems to me to be a bit peculiar. Anyway, as the lagoons, as the main river is beginning to dry up, and as the lagoons are starting to dry out, we are starting to see some increased conglomerations of animals in certain key places. I should point out that this is actually Thornycroft's giraffe, which is another of the endemic species in the Luangwa Valley. In fact, Thornycroft's giraffe is one of the key reasons why the Luangwa Valley was, or South Luangwa was turned into a national park. Because of the importance of this particular subspecies of giraffe. Although curiously, the majority of the giraffe actually live outside the national park, so I'm not quite sure whether they'd read the book or not, but hey, that's the way it goes. As you get through the dry season, as we move through from the beginning of the dry season, which is technically the beginning of June, through to the end of October and into November, so things start drying out and we start to see large herds of buffalo. We start to see reasonably large numbers of wildebeest. This is another Luangwa speciality. This is Cookson's wildebeest, another subspecies of wildebeest, but a particularly beautiful one. As with wildebeest in East Africa, you generally see these in association with zebra, though curiously in this photograph I don't seem to have got any zebra. But these have an unusually pinky hue to them and very prominent stripes. Luangwa is also great for predators. Any of you that have been before, any of you perhaps who are coming with me later this year or next year will be rewarded with some fantastic predator viewing, lions particularly, and we'll look at some others a little bit further on. Mid to late October, all of the impalas start to have their young, and that's an exciting time. Impalas are, I think that for me, the least photographed and probably the most beautiful of all of the antelope in Africa. People think that because there's so many of them, there's other occasions I can get a photograph on another occasion, but it's not. They are just stunning. The others that are slightly less stunning, I showed you a puku previously. This is a puku with his own particular type of headdress. For some reason or other, every now and again, when they walk underneath the tree, they will gather up a nest. This is a nest, one of the weaver's nests, which somehow or other it's managed to get stuck on its horns. Don't know if it's deliberate or not, but anyway. It seemed like quite a good shot, and it looks rather unusual. Another of Luangwa's specialities are these zebra, subspecies of Birchall zebra. This is Crawshays zebra, which is another beautiful, beautiful animal. These last few shots having been taken on foot, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is one of the dry lagoons. The river is in the background beyond the greenery, but this would have been early in the season, in fact right the way up probably till August or September. This would have been absolutely full of water. As it dried out, um, and all sorts of other fish, all sorts of other birds, sorry, fishing to get rid of all of the fish that are there, really enjoying a great opportunity. As it gets drier, there's other interesting things that we start to see. Occasionally we see things like serval, and we start to see crocodiles coming much further out onto shore, sometimes hunting, and we start to see large gatherings of elephants. The elephants in Luangwa, I should mention, are much, much smaller than those elsewhere in the country, much smaller than the ones that we see on the lower Zambezi, much smaller than the ones we see at Victoria Falls and out elsewhere. And these are deemed to be a subspecies of the forest elephant from a little bit further north. And again, of course, we sometimes get some rather interesting behavior when they're reaching high up to get seeds or leaves or branches from trees which no one else can quite reach. And it's nice in the evening sun or the early morning sun when we get close to elephants to try and experiment with some slightly different photography. The bird life is unmissable here. This is the bird which introduces most people to bird watching. This is a lilac-breasted roller, and if it's not one of these, it's carmine bee-eaters. It was lilac-breasted rollers for me, but we see carmine bee-eaters in staggering numbers. The carmines and the Luangwa Valley are synonymous with one another. These are southern carmines, which are far more beautiful than the carmines you get in East Africa. The colours are much richer, and they don't have nearly so much of the dark blue on them. So in East Africa, the carmines have a dark blue throat, the same sort of colour that's on the top of their heads, but these really are very, very special. We try and spend quite a bit of time looking at the birds. It's difficult not to because there's so much wonderful bird life. Battler eagles. If I'm lucky enough to come back to Earth after, in 50 years or 100 years' time, I'm coming back as one of these. These are absolute crackers. These are my favourite birds of all time. Leopards. Luangwa probably has the highest naturally occurring density of leopards anywhere in Africa. And we're particularly lucky with the sightings that we have had. It would be very, very unusual to go on safari in the Luangwa Valley and not see leopard. We do a lot of nighttime safaris in the Luangwa, and that's one of the key things that we're looking out for. Leopards are one of the key species we're on the hunt for. But of course, there's other things as well, like scrub hares, like genets, and also, although this photograph was taken in the early morning, on an early morning game drive, things like owls, and this is a giant eagle owl that we're looking at here. Leopards, which I mentioned, we are now seeing them more and more and more during the day. I don't know why we're seeing them more during the day now than we did 10 years ago, but we now see them constantly during the day. No guarantees, but we see them a hell of a lot. And this is very often the first sight of a leopard. Perhaps not quite so close. That's obviously taken with a long lens. But this photograph was actually taken on a walking safari, and it's a very unusual sighting to see a leopard in a tree that actually isn't bothered about us. So this was an amazing sighting. We got to within about 30 meters of it, and it was absolutely sound asleep. The leaves were rustling underneath us. There was a lot of wind. It couldn't hear us. And then it suddenly did hear us. And it moved so quickly and ran down the tree. It moved at such a pace, I didn't have time to move my camera, which was at the time by my side, from my side up to my eye. It was that fast. Nick mentioned walking safaris right back at the very beginning. Walking safaris were created in Luangwa. They were invented by a gentleman who Nick mentioned, who I used to work for, Norman Carr. Norman was a hunter turned gamekeeper, and he decided many, many moons ago, he was a remarkable man, but he decided that there were probably far more people that would be interested in looking at and photographing wildlife than there would be people who wanted to get rid of the wildlife and shoot it. So he set up are just amazing the way that they operate. Maximum of 7 people on a walk. You will always have a naturalist guide, and there is always an armed scout. And the beautiful thing about being on a walking safari is you have an opportunity to look at and talk about things which you just wouldn't have a chance to look at and talk about if you were in a vehicle. One of my great friends, Aubrey, is at a civet midden, and we're having a chat about civets and what they do and how they do it and so on and so forth. You probably wouldn't do that in a vehicle. You probably wouldn't get out of a vehicle and have a look at this skull and the remains of an animal that has been killed by lions and discuss it and work out how it might have happened. You probably wouldn't necessarily stop and take time to look at and photograph tracks. And it's very much down to the skill and knowledge and extraordinary enthusiasm of the guides there to bring places like this to life. Just a couple of shots of the lodges. This is one of the lodges on the outskirts of the national park in the south. This is Nkwali, accommodates 12 people. This is one of the lodges that we use all the time. A wonderful, wonderful lodge. Oh, well, they're all wonderful, but this is another wonderful lodge called Tafika. The lodges, as I say, have a very Zambian feel to them. They are simple, they're safe, and they're particularly tasty if you're a passing elephant, as you can see. And this is another of the lodges. They are beautiful. They are very characterful. They are all different. And I should, at this point, mention the ease with which you can move around the country, the ease with which you can move around in Zambia, but also in Southern Africa and East Africa generally. We are all incredibly conscious now of COVID. We're very conscious of the need to be safe in the way that we travel. And traveling in Africa in private aircraft is very, very simple. This looks quite a big aircraft. In actual fact, it can take 12 or 14 people, just depending on the configuration of the aircraft. We have many people who travel with us in multi-generational family groups, and they like to have their own plane. It's a wonderful thing. It doesn't need to be, if you're traveling in a group of 6 or 8 or 10 or 12, it doesn't need to be any more expensive than using the scheduled services that there are within Zambia. But it's rather wonderful actually landing at the doorstep of your lodge in your own private plane. And of course, if you think about that in respect of the world that we presently live in, it's probably a healthier and safer way to travel than traveling on scheduled aircraft. Albeit that on the ground, we are very, very conscious of the protocols that are being used by all of our colleagues and our ground agents and the camps and lodges that we work with. But we can talk more about that in Q&A if you like. Just a quick final stop before I finish at Victoria Falls. It's a wonderful crossroads in Africa. It's accessible, of course, from Zambia, from Zimbabwe, from Botswana, from Namibia. And it's a truly wonderful, wonderful place. I love it. I would strongly recommend that if you haven't been, that you go. I would strongly recommend that if you go, you would go again. Because whether you go there in the wet season, as per this photograph, or if you go there in the dry season, there is always something amazing to see. There's great wildlife here. I've seen all of the plains game that I've seen elsewhere, including buffalo and elephant. Elephants actually walking through the petrol station and in Victoria Falls on the Zimbabwean side. I've seen elephants walking up the main road on the Zambian side in Livingstone, as well as a whole bunch of other things, including lions and waterbuck and all sorts of lovely things. It is amazing. So look, that was a whiz around the country. With any luck, some of you are still awake, but you may not be, who knows. But for now, that is my journey, if you like, that I've taken. Nick may well have one or two questions. If he does, I should be delighted to answer them.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much. What a delight to be taken to a faraway place. What a gorgeous utopia Zambia is. Really, really wonderful, and great images as well. We have had a lot of questions come through, particularly on email. I'm afraid that with 142 connections, we're not going to be able to get through them all. But there are some common themes that are coming through on the questions, Chris. I think that we'll endeavour to cover about half a dozen or so, if that's
Sure.
okay, with you and everyone. First of all, we have got a couple of advanced questions, okay,
yep.
that were sent through when people were signing up. The first I'm going to ask is on behalf of Janice Warford. Thank you, Janice, for your question. And it's a great question to start with, because it's a question that we're asked about a lot of the destinations that we travel to. When's the good time to go?
There's two answers to that. One is really pretty much any time, any day, any week. But it also very much depends on what you want to see. So it is certainly the case that you could go to Zambia year round. The majority of people will travel to Zambia in Zambia's dry season, which runs from the beginning of June, middle of May, beginning of June, through to the end of October, middle of November. And in most places, the camps and lodges will be open from the beginning of June through to the end of October. There's a bit of extension on that. As you go through that period, it gets hotter and drier. As it gets hotter and drier, so the wildlife concentrates around waterholes and around main river courses. So for photographers, it's particularly good to go towards the end of that period. If you are interested in the birds and the bird life, if that's something that is of particular interest to you, then you should also consider going earlier in the year. So March, April, May, June. Basically, from November through to March, there is a great influx of migrant birds into Central and Southern Africa, of which Zambia is a part. That is stuff coming in from Northern Europe, from Central Asia, all sorts of amazing things like steppe eagles and red-footed falcons, down to various warblers and all sorts of other wonderful, wonderful things. But in addition to that, lots of the small, diminutive, perhaps less noticeable birds in the dry season suddenly come into their resplendent colours. The red bishop, which I showed you earlier, would in the dry season appear to be what I would say sort of diminutive and sparrow-like, so rather dull in appearance. Apologies for those of you that particularly like sparrows. But when they go into their breeding dress, they have these amazing colours. Some of them have incredibly long tails and bright reds, bright yellows, bright greens, bright oranges. So if you're particularly interested in the birding side of things, March to June, or the latter part of the dry season, that's when things are starting to come in again, end of October, November. If birding is not so much your thing, you have a good but passing interest in birding and really interested in mammals and everything else, and mammal photography, not to the exclusion of birds, but travel June to October.
Great, thank you, Chris. Janice does ask, her question consists of a couple of sub-questions, and I'm going to bring in a question that we've just had in on the chat from Margaret Bishton. Margaret, thank you to you as well for your question. Chris, Margaret is heading off to South Luangwa in November of this year. Her first question is, will that be the wet season, the green season? And her second question is, what type of footwear should she be taking? Because she's going to be, I dare say, she'll be doing a walking safari. And relating to the walking safari, Janice Warford was asking, how much walking is there on a walking safari? You know, what kind of terrain, duration, distance, you know, is covered?
Okay. Okay, so forgive me, the first question was Janice's traveling in September?
November, is that the wet season?
November. So November's right on the edge. November is a fabulous month to be there. It will be dry. Luangwa doesn't start to see the big rains coming till the second half of November. And even that doesn't matter. It's very, very dramatic. It's hot. By comparison with the temperatures we're experiencing here at the moment. And the rain, it can be cold, but 5 or 10 minutes later, it warms up. So the rain's cool. As a point of technicality, yes, it's the rainy season, but in actual fact, it won't be raining. The rains, the big rains come February, March time, you know, late January, February, March. One of the most fantastic things about being there in November is massive buildup of cumulonimbus clouds, these incredibly dramatic skies. There will be lots and lots and lots of young impalas around. All of the impala lambs come in the last couple of weeks of October, so there'll be lots of young impalas. There'll be large numbers of young warthogs. The photographic opportunities will be absolutely amazing. The river will be very, very dry. The waterholes will be dry because they don't fill up until March, April time. That's when they're starting to fill up with the previous 2 or 3 months of rain. So November is, as a point of technicality, it's green season, but when you're there on the ground, it's dry.
Great.
You might get a couple of showers of rain.
Relating to the walking safaris, I'm sure that it's a common question, but how much walking is there on a walking safari? What sort of duration and distance should people be anticipating? We're presuming they're not going to be doing a Kilimanjaro style trek.
No, it's so I'm actually going to answer the very first of the questions that you asked in relation to the walking safari, which is what footwear should I take? Good trainer type walking shoes are brilliant. You don't need to buy anything special. You don't need to buy walking boots. I personally wear a pair of Merrell walking shoes, and if I don't have Merrells, they just happen to fit me nicely, then I'll just wear a pair of trainers. The really nice thing about walking in the Luangwa Valley is the Luangwa Valley is flat. It's completely flat. There's no rocks, there's no boulders, it's silt. You're walking across flat terrain. Other than twigs and bushes and things like that, there's nothing to trip you up. You're walking on flat ground. It's not a route march. It's absolutely a walking safari. I showed you a picture of my pal Aubrey, who was crouched down. He was looking at a civet midden. The whole point of a walking safari is to look and see and feel and sense and smell the stuff that's around you. On a walking safari, you'll need binoculars. You will be well advised to take your camera, and that's 1 pair of binoculars per person. Definitely take your camera and a spare lens or 2. Different people like to do things different ways. On a walking safari, you get up first thing in the morning, you'll have a cup of tea and some toast. Different camps do things slightly differently, but broadly speaking, you'll get up, you'll have tea and toast, perhaps some cereal, and then you'll head off on your walking safari early whilst it's nice and cool. You might be out, depending on the strength of those that are walking, you might be out for 3 or 4 or 5 hours, but it won't feel like it. Because you'll be stopping constantly. You will be looking at the tracks, you'll be looking at the trails, you'll be smelling flowers, you'll be sat by a river or sat by a lagoon, watching and waiting for the wildlife to come to you. It is one of the best things you could possibly do. A lot of the camps offer walking safaris in the mornings. A lot of the camps offer walking safaris in the mornings and in the afternoons. The afternoon walking safaris are slightly different. They tend to be shorter. So I should say, when you go out on a walking safari, if you're on a morning walking safari, you will always have a break where you stop by a lagoon and wait for the world to come to you, if you like. And that will so carrying coffee, probably cake, maybe biscuits and sandwiches as well. So you have a nice break. It's very relaxed. It's fantastic. An evening walking safari is slightly different because it's starting to get cooler. You probably won't go out until after afternoon tea. So you probably won't go out on your walking safari until about 4:15, 4:30, just depending on the time of year. So you will only be out. In Zambia, the sun sets on or about 6 o'clock throughout the year, just because of its location on Earth, relatively close to the equator. And you can't walk at nighttime. So an afternoon walking safari, you might only be out for an hour and a half, but they are golden. They are beautiful times to be out. There is one slightly different type of walking safari that I might mention, which is, so if you're staying at any of the camps in Luangwa, you can go on a walking safari from almost all of them. Some people like to go on a dedicated walking safari, and they will go and do 2 or 3 or 4 days on a walking safari. You might be based at a single camp, which solely does walking. In other words, a camp where there are no vehicles at all. So you might walk out from a lodge or a camp that has vehicles, you'll cross a river, you'll go to a very small camp which can only accommodate 6 people. Now all you'll do from that camp is walk. And that's another slightly different, rather wonderful experience. Quite nice for a family group to take over a camp like that, or perhaps a small group of friends, which is what I've done, as you know, Nick, on a number of occasions.
Indeed, indeed. Chris, I'm going to switch over to the chat now. So I've had quite a lot of questions come in the last 10 minutes or so. And one of the first ones that came in during the presentation was from Leslie Simmons. Thank you again to you for your question. You'd mentioned photography and cameras earlier, Chris, and we've actually had a couple of questions that relate to photography. So I'm going to try and put both questions to you, okay? Leslie, very specifically, was asking, what would you say is the most useful camera lens to take? And in particular, what sort of focal length should they have if they want to try and take the sort of pictures that you had with regard to the kingfisher that you showed us at the start of the presentation and the leopard?
Okay.
And so if you can just hold that one. And then Andy, again, Andy, thank you for your question. You're asking about the photographic facilities in any of the boats. Do they have gimbals or do they have beam bags, that kind of stuff? So if you wouldn't mind just talking about that, cameras and photography for a moment, that would be brilliant.
Okay. So all of the camps and lodges are very familiar with having photographers and people who are interested in photography on safari. It varies from camp to camp. So if for someone that is mega interested in photography and wants to come back with cracking images and wants to go out with great photographic guides, we might alter our recommendation of camp or lodge, just depending on the nature of the conversation that we have. Most of the camps offer, have bean bags, or if they don't have bean bags, you could take out a pillow, or I will often just have a fleece with me, which I might be wearing, or maybe I'm not wearing. I'll take that off. I'll wrap it around the bar of a vehicle or something. That's quite a good thing to have. What quite a lot of people do is they will take an empty bean bag, so they're not carrying beans with them, with all the peculiarities and curiosities that might have of getting through customs and immigration. So they'll have an empty bean bag, and they might then ask the kitchen to fill the bean bag up with rice. That's quite a good trick to do. I'm sure many of the photographers would know that. In terms of focal length of lenses, that partly depends on the type of camera body you've got. I'd be delighted to carry this conversation on afterwards, or by telephone, or email for that matter. But the photo of the kingfisher, the photo of the leopards, I took both of those with the same camera, and I think it was my 70 to 200mm lens. They were that close. In actual fact, I had to get out of the way of that kingfisher, otherwise I'd have knocked it off its perch. And the leopard wasn't all that far away either. However, I tend to carry 2 cameras with me. And I have one as a 70 to 200mm lens on it, and I have the other that my other camera has a 200 to 400.
Great.
They are quite adequate. And of course, with digital technology now, with a digital camera, the camera bodies are becoming much lighter.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's quite an interesting factor. I think, did I answer all the questions? I can't remember.
You did, yes. Thank you very much. And I just want to wrap up with a couple of questions from people who are travelling to Zambia. The first one is from Ray Emerton. Again, thanks for your question. Ray is travelling with us to Zambia on an itinerary called the Classic South Luangwa Safari. For those of you who need to know, like to know, that's basically 8 days in country, 5 days of which are spent in South Luangwa at Flat Dogs Camp.
Right.
So Ray's doing that, and he's also extending after that, and he's staying in Lion Camp, which is in a different area in South Luangwa. And his question is very pertinent, which is, are there different species that he will see in either location that he may not see in another? Are there particular highlights in one location over another?
Technically, the answer to that is no. However, Lion Camp is a long way further north than Flat Dogs, and Lion Camp is in a much more remote location. In fact, they've been doing some filmmaking from Lion Camp. There was a series on Channel 4, I think, which came out last year or possibly the year before, about lions, which was filmed from Lion Camp, and they're either in the process of doing another one or they've just finished, and it's going to come out again relatively soon. So in terms of the species that you're likely to see, the species, you will mostly see the same species. Having said that, with Lion Camp being that much further north, you stand a much greater chance of seeing things like wildebeest in the north, and curiously hartebeest, and oribi, and possibly reedbuck, just depending on where you go. You're unlikely to see those from Flat Dogs. However, from Flat Dogs, you're far more likely to see giraffe, which you're much less likely to see when you're up at Lion Camp. So they are, those two locations complement each other superbly.
Yeah, great. Okay, that's great. And David and Deborah, thank you for your question. You're going to be travelling to South Luangwa and also to Vic Falls. No spoilers, please, Chris, but I think that the presentation answers the question that was posed by them both, which is, what can they expect? And I think they can expect a wonderful time in South Luangwa, and down in Vic Falls, they're going to be staying in the Waterbury Lodge, which is one of the finest places to stay down there. It's perfectly positioned at the foot of the falls. Anything else to comment on that?
No, I mean, goodness. Hopefully my presentation hasn't spoiled your enthusiasm for going to Zambia. I guess you're doing visiting two of the finest places in Africa, basically. I mean, what's not to like about that? It's fantastic.
Last question, which is a very obvious question to ask, and it came in earlier in the week. It's from Louise McDade, and she's particularly keen to know how things are operating in Zambia during the pandemic. We understand ourselves because we work within the tourism industry, and we work very closely with our suppliers and our guides, and out, in all the countries that we go, but particularly in Zambia. What is the impact of the pandemic, and what can we do as travelers, and what can we do as a tour operator?
The impact of the pandemic throughout Africa, and Zambia is not any different from any of the other countries. The impact of the pandemic in Zambia has been significant. It's been significant because we're not going, and we're not there, and we're not taking people there. What that has meant, of course, there's pluses and minuses here. From a wildlife point of view, I guess it means that the wildlife has been allowed to, can I kind of use the word mature? It's perhaps not quite the right word, but the wildlife has been largely which is wonderful. Not that when we go, we disturb the wild at all. That would be entirely counterproductive. But the wildlife has been left to do its own thing. There's some real positives about that, but there's also some real negatives about that as well, because when we are on safari, we act as eyes and ears. And when we act as eyes and ears, we are acting as eyes and ears as if we are rangers. And that's particularly good from an anti-poaching point of view. In actual fact, in Zambia, I know, and Luangwa particularly, we have been incredibly lucky, and there hasn't been a big increase in poaching, because the local populations are so dependent upon the wildlife. But obviously we need to get back. We need to get back traveling to these places as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah.
In terms of the protocols and things that are being used by the guys on the ground, they are exceptional. And their consciousness of the need for social distancing, the need for appropriate and continual sanitization, the need to always be healthy and correct in the way that they operate, I would say is beyond recognition. And I think it's a real credit to the way that these guys operate. Parks haven't closed. Parks have remained open. People have still been traveling to these places. Very few and far between, but people have still been traveling. Very few Brits, but some Europeans have been going. Some people from elsewhere around the world have been visiting. These guys, have remained very strong and are looking after the places that look after them.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that wraps up our questions, and the point, Chris, that you make regarding lodges and suppliers and guides in Zambia, being very aware of the need to be acting in a safe and healthy and responsible manner in respect of COVID, is actually being echoed not only throughout other African countries, but in many of the other destinations, if not all of the other destinations to which we travel. And we are working with suppliers there in order to help them develop the right sort of control measures that need to be in place for when tourism opens up. And certainly not being afraid to book at the moment, I think, is the key thing. Suppliers and destinations need to know that there is life coming through, and that's the key message there. Chris, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your expertise. It's just such a pleasure listening to you, and clearly, obviously a wealth of experience there. And to everybody who remains in the presentation, I do hope that this evening has been informative, and I really hope that it's been inspirational as well. And I do hope that it does encourage you to travel to Zambia, of course, but it may be something that has kind of spurred you on to look at other destinations as well. But thank you all so much for staying with us, and whenever you are looking to travel overseas, do please get in touch with us. And whenever you want to talk about overseas travel, do please get in touch. We're always happy to talk about the destinations that we offer. And when you do next travel, do it safely, and do look after yourselves in the meantime as well. I'm going to end the presentation for everybody now. So thank you all very much. Stay safe, and we'll get through all of this together. Thank you very much. Good night.